It was one of those grey London mornings where the sky looked like it had given up entirely, heavy and flattened, pressing down on everything beneath it like a wet blanket dropped from a great height. The kind of morning where even the pigeons along the mall walked instead of flew, as if the air itself was too thick to bother with. Buckingham Palace stood at the far end of the road the way it always did, enormous and pale and indifferent to weather, to mood, to the quiet low hum of tension that had been building for days inside its walls. Staff moved through the corridors with the careful precision of people who understood that the walls had ears, that a misplaced word could travel faster than any headline, and that on certain mornings, the atmosphere inside the palace felt less like a home and more like a chessboard where every piece was already mid-move and nobody had announced whose turn it was. Camilla, the queen consort, had woken early. Not because she was an early riser by nature, she wasn't, but because the day ahead had been sitting on her chest since the night before, dense and specific in the way that only days involving formal ceremony and tight timelines and large numbers of people watching could be. There was a luncheon, a procession, and a presentation of honors. And, threaded through all of it, the kind of behind-the-scenes choreography that royal engagements demanded: who walked where, who stood beside whom, which tiara was appropriate, which order of dress, which carriage, which route. These weren't small decisions. They weren't questions of vanity or preference. They were questions basically of protocol, and protocol, in the royal household, wasn't a suggestion. It was architecture. It held the entire structure upright. She sat at her dressing table in the early morning quiet, surrounded by the particular stillness of a room that hadn't yet been entered by the noise of the day. Her lady-in-waiting, a woman of impeccable composure who had served in this role long enough to have developed a kind of psychic sensitivity to the queen, I think, consort's moods, was laying out the morning's necessities with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Camilla watched her own reflection in the mirror with an expression that wasn't quite worried. Not quite calm, something in between, the face of a person doing very quiet, very private calculations. The tiara had already been selected. Or for what it's worth, rather, a selection had been made by the team. The team, that efficient, background-running machinery of royal household staff, royal dressers, protocol officers, and palace administrators, had determined which piece from the collection was appropriate for the occasion, had consulted the record of recent appearances to avoid repetition, had cross-referenced with the event's level of formality, and had arrived at a conclusion. The conclusion sat in its box, gleaming and certain of itself, on the low table near the window. Camilla had looked at it the night before and said nothing. She had looked at it this morning and said nothing. But, actually, the look itself, that particular kind of sustained, assessing silence, hadn't gone unnoticed by her lady-in-waiting, who had been in this position long enough to know that silence from Camilla wasn't always agreement. You know, sometimes silence was consideration. And, sometimes it was the very quiet start of something else entirely. The day moved forward the way days do when there are too many moving pieces in a cascade of small events, each one triggering the next, each one necessary and none of them particularly memorable on their own. Breakfast. Briefing. The arrival of additional staff. The appearance of the senior dresser with the tiara box, already open, already presenting the piece as settled fact. The laying out of the gown. The careful, methodical preparation of a woman who had learned, over years, that hadn't always been easy, how to present herself as a specific and legible kind of figure in public, composed, warm, steady, appropriate. She was dressed by mid-morning. The gown was correct. The jewels, the earrings, the necklace, the bracelet were correct. The hair was done, the makeup finished, the entire exterior architecture of the day assembled with precision. And, then, she stood, and she looked at herself in the full-length mirror near the door, and she reached up and touched the tiara on her head with 2 fingers, lightly, the way you touch something you're not yet entirely sure belongs to you, and she said, quietly but clearly, to no one in particular and everyone in the room, that she wanted the other one. The room didn't freeze. People in royal service learn very early not to freeze, because freezing reads as panic, and panic is not useful. The thing about serving in these households is that usefulness is the primary currency and everything else is secondary to it. But there was a pause. Not a long pause. Maybe 3 seconds. The kind of pause that contains a rapid and invisible series of calculations, logistical, diplomatic, hierarchical, all happening simultaneously behind composed faces. The other tiara meant the one that hadn't been chosen by the team. The one that hadn't been entered into today's record. The one that, in the precise and carefully maintained language of palace protocol, hadn't been authorized for this occasion by the relevant household authority. This wasn't a small thing. In a kind of private home, a woman changing her jewelry is not an event. In a royal household, on a day of public ceremony, with a procession timetable already locked, a guest pretty much list already assembled and journalists and photographers already positioned along the route, a change of this nature had to move through channels. It had to be noted, approved, recorded, communicated. It wasn't that the change itself was impossible. It was that it couldn't simply happen. Nothing, in this world, simply happened. Her lady-in-waiting said, gently, that she would need to check with the household. Camilla said she understood. The lady-in-waiting, left the room, which Camilla stood by the window and looked out at the grey morning and waited, which was something she had learned to do without making it look like waiting, without making it look like anything at all. The household, in this instance, meant the senior staff who managed the logistical and protocol dimensions of the royal diary. It meant the individuals whose job it was to ensure that things ran correctly, that the right things happened in the right order, that nothing went sideways in a way that would land on the front page of a newspaper or create a diplomatic incident or require a correction to the official record. These were serious people doing a serious job, and they took it seriously, and when the question about the tiara reached them, they took that seriously too, perhaps more seriously, as it turned out, than Camilla had anticipated. The answer that came back wasn't a yes. It wasn't exactly a no either, and it was something more complicated than either, delivered through the appropriate channels with the kind of careful, deferential language that's used in these situations, language designed to communicate constraint without communicating confrontation, to say that something can't be done while leaving the door technically open to further discussion. What it amounted honestly to, stripped of its careful wrapping, was this: the tiara change hadn't been pre-authorized, the relevant authority hadn't signed off, and proceeding without that sign-off wasn't something the household could accommodate on the morning of a public engagement with a fixed timeline. Camilla received this information. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, still quietly, that she would like to speak to someone about it. This was the moment, unremarkable on its surface, the kind of thing that could happen and often did happen in the management of busy royal schedules, a small friction between a principal and their household, the kind of thing that gets resolved and forgotten when something shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically, but the shift was real. Because the person who was ultimately going to be reached, the person whose role in the household gave them the standing to make this call, wasn't someone who took kindly to last-minute changes. Wasn't someone who regarded the personal preferences of any individual, regardless of rank, as sufficient reason to override established protocol on the morning of a public event. That person, as it happened, was already in the building. Princess N, the Princess Royal, had been at the palace since early morning. She had arrived, as she always arrived, without fanfare and without the particular atmosphere of importance that follows some royals from room to room. She carried no entourage of unnecessary people. She walked at the pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going and expected to get there without interruption. She had a full diary of her own, a separate set of engagements and responsibilities that ran in parallel with the day's main event. She had arrived early because she was always early, and she was always early because she found lateness somewhere between incomprehensible and offensive. She was in one of the working rooms on the upper floor when the message reached her, relayed through staff, passed along the quiet internal communication network that runs beneath every royal occasion like an electrical current, invisible until something needs to move through it. The message was clear. The Queen Consort was requesting a change to the authorized jewelry selection for today's engagement. The household had declined to authorize the change without senior approval. The Queen Consort wished to discuss it further. Princess Anne read the message or received it, in the way that such things are received, in person, from a member of staff who delivered it with appropriate gravity, and her expression didn't change. This wasn't unusual. Plus, her expression rarely changed in response to information. She had spent enough decades in service to the crown to have developed a face that processed news without broadcasting a reaction, a face that received information and, then, did something with it internally before anyone outside could read what was happening. She set down what she was doing, which she said she would come down. And this moment of a senior royal member setting down her own work and coming down to address a dispute about a tiara on the morning of a public engagement was the moment when what had been a small internal friction became something with sharper edges. Not a crisis. The word crisis is too large for this. But something with weight. Plus, something that the staff on both sides of it understood, in that particular way that people in royal service understand things, completely, immediately, without needing it spelled out, wasn't going to be resolved quickly, or easily, or without someone being required to bend. The question was who. Downstairs, Camilla was still by the window, and she wasn't pacing. Pacing would have communicated agitation, and she wasn't someone who communicated agitation. She stood, with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that stillness is itself a form of persistence, that remaining in a position, physically, literally, in a room, by a window, communicates something without requiring a word. Her lady-in-waiting had returned but said nothing new. The kind of staff in the room moved with the careful quietness of people in the presence of a situation that has not yet resolved itself. The tiara she wanted wasn't outrageous. This is important to understand. It wasn't inappropriate to the occasion. It wasn't an for what it's worth, unconventional choice. It was, by any reasonable measure, a suitable piece for a formal daytime engagement of this level. What it was, basically, wasn't the piece that had been pre-selected and pre-authorized. And, in the world of royal protocol, the difference between those two things, suitable and authorized, is not a small difference. It is, in fact, almost the entire difference. Suitability is a matter of judgment. Authorization is a matter of record. And the record, in this household, mattered. When Princess Anne came into the room, she came in the way she came into all rooms, directly, without prelude, already in the middle of the matter before she had crossed the threshold. She didn't greet the room. She didn't, make social noise. Plus, she looked at Camilla, and Camilla looked at her, and the two women regarded each other with the kind of frank, clear attention that happens between people who aren't performing for each other, who have known each other long enough and been through enough together to have dispensed with performance entirely. And looked at the tiara on Camilla's head. She looked at the other box, still open on the table. She looked back at Camilla. For what it's worth, then, she spoke. And what she said, and how she said it, and what happened in the room in the moments after she said it, that was where this morning, which had begun with gray skies and quiet calculations and a small internal disagreement that should have been routine, became the kind of morning that people who were present would find themselves thinking about for a very long time afterward. Not because it was loud. Not because it was theatrical. But because it was absolutely, unmistakably clear. The clarity was the thing. In a world that ran on careful language and diplomatic wrapping and the thoughtful management of every word, clarity, blunt, unornamented, exact, was its own kind of force. And Princess Anne, whatever else might be said about her, was the most unornamented person in that building. She didn't, do diplomatic wrapping. She didn't manage honestly, words for comfort. She, to be fair, said what she meant with the directness of someone who had never needed softening to do it. The room, which had been very quiet, became quieter. Outside the window, London continued, which the pigeons walked. The grey sky pressed down. The procession route was already being prepared, barriers set, positions established, the whole elaborate machinery of a royal public day beginning to move toward its starting position. Inside the room, 3 seconds of a particular silence stretched and held, and, in that silence, everything that was about to happen was already, in some sense, decided. What the guard at the door heard, moments later, wasn't a raised voice. It wasn't an argument in any conventional sense. It was, something more controlled than that, and more final. It was the sound of a woman who had been asked to hold a line, had held it, through channels, through proper process, through the correct mechanisms, and who was now being required to hold it in person, face to face, with a senior royal on one side and the weight of every protocol ever established in this household on the other. The guard, a man who had been in service long enough to have developed the specific skill of being fully present without registering anything, stood in his position and didn't move. This was his job. He was very good at it. But even with all his training and all his years and all his practiced invisibility, felt the particular charge in the air that comes when two immovable things come into contact with each other and neither one bends. Something was going to give. It was, just not yet entirely clear what. The morning light sort of shifted slightly as clouds moved somewhere above the building. In the room, the tiara in its box caught the new light and threw a small, sharp glint across the ceiling there and, gone, a half-second of brightness in an otherwise contained and serious space. Nobody looked at it. Everyone was watching the two women by the window, one standing very still, one having just finished saying something that had landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward in every direction, and no one yet certain how far they would go. Princess and hadn't raised her voice. This was the thing people who hadn't witnessed it might have found hardest to believe afterward, that none of it involved shouting, none of it involved the kind of performative anger that reads as emotion losing control. What Anne had done was something more precise than that. She had spoken at a volume that was entirely, almost clinically, appropriate to the size of the room, and she had chosen her words with the kind of selectivity that comes not from carefulness but from absolute certainty about what needs to be said and what does not. She had looked at the two tiaras, the one on Camilla's head, the one in its box, and she had said, in substance, that protocol existed for reasons that didn't disappear because someone found them inconvenient on a given morning, and that the authorization process that governed the selection of jewelry for public engagements wasn't a bureaucratic formality to be worked around, but a structural necessity to be respected, and that if the selected piece had been chosen through the proper process, then that process had already spoken and what it had said wasn't a draft awaiting revision. She had said all of this without any of the softening language that most people in royal service automatically reach for. No, of course I understand, prefacing the no, it's simply the threading through the constraint. Just the substance. Direct. The constraint, stated as plainly as geography, which Camilla had listened. This is important to understand too. Camilla wasn't a woman who didn't listen. She had spent enough years navigating environments that weren't originally designed for her, where the terms were set before she arrived. The expectations embedded in every room she walked into, to have become an extraordinarily good listener. She had learned to hear what was underneath what was being said as much as what was on the surface of it. And what she heard underneath Anne's words wasn't personal hostility, it was something more institutional than that, something that wasn't really about tiaras at all. It was about lines. Where they were drawn. Who drew them, which, and what happened when someone appeared to be testing them. The room around them was managing itself with the practiced efficiency of a room full of people who were being paid, in every sense, to not react. The lady-in-waiting had positioned herself near the door in a way that was clearly deliberate, close enough to be available, far enough to be absent. The dresser had turned her attention to something on the table near the window that may or may not have required attention. The remaining staff had achieved the remarkable condition of physical presence combined with complete social invisibility that's one of the genuine skills of royal household service. The guard outside the door could hear nothing specific through it. He hadn't been meant to hear anything. But he had been in position long enough that morning to have felt, through the door, through the walls, through the particular atmospheric shift that happens in a corridor when a room adjacent to it contains something weighted, that the conversation inside wasn't the kind of conversation that resolves itself in 3 minutes and then moves on. It was basically the other kind. Plus, the basically kind that takes a shape and keeps it. What happened next inside the room wasn't visible to him. What happened next, for a period of approximately 20 minutes that would later be described by those present with a remarkable variety of carefully chosen words, all of them accurate, none of them complete, was a conversation that expanded and contracted and turned back on itself in the way that conversations between two people who are both entirely certain they're right tend to do. Look, not a fight. I guess, a negotiation. But a negotiation between two people neither of whom was fundamentally willing to concede the central point, which made it something more like two trains on the same track, heading toward each other at moderate speed, each one waiting for the other to switch lines. Camilla's position wasn't irrational. It wasn't even, strictly speaking, wrong, and the tiara she wanted was appropriate to the occasion. She knew it was appropriate. And, who had looked at it, also knew it was appropriate in any objective aesthetic or social sense. The question wasn't appropriateness. Plus, the question was process. The piece hadn't been pre-authorized. Changing it on the morning of an engagement, after the official record had already been set, required going back through the authorization process. Which required a sign-off from the Lord Chamberlain's office, which required time, which required the kind of administrative back and forth that the morning's timeline didn't comfortably accommodate. This was Anne's position. Plus, it wasn't personal. It was procedural. The procedure existed because procedures always exist for reasons, because 100 years of royal public engagements had demonstrated, in various specific and, occasionally spectacular ways, what happened when the logistics of ceremony were managed loosely, when decisions were made at the last minute by individuals operating on personal preference rather than authorized plan, when the structure was treated as flexible on the days when it felt inconvenient. I guess, the structure wasn't flexible. That was what made it structure, but Camilla was also right that the piece was appropriate. And she was right that the timeline, while tight, wasn't impossible if the relevant authorization could be expedited. And she was right, and this was the part that sat underneath everything else, that neither of them named directly but that was present in the room as clearly as anything spoken, that she wasn't a junior staff member requesting a personal accommodation. She was the queen consort. The weight of that title, in this particular exchange, in this particular household, in this particular point in the history of the British monarchy, wasn't a simple or straightforward thing. It wasn't a trump card, because nothing in this household worked on the basis of trump cards. Rank didn't override protocol, title didn't override process. The whole point of the system was that it ran on rules rather than on the preferences of individuals, regardless of how highly positioned those individuals were. But it was also not nothing. It was real. It was present, both women in that room felt it. And felt it particularly, not because she was intimidated by it and had been in this family long enough and had worked through enough of its internal architecture to be intimidated by very few things, and a jurisdictional question about jewelry wasn't among them. But she felt it because she understood, with the clarity of someone who has spent decades thinking carefully about institutions and what preserves them, that the way you handle the moment when rank and procedure come into contact with each other matters enormously. Not for this morning. For what comes after this morning. For the dozens of mornings like this one that will follow, each one watching for what the precedent is. If you bend the procedure for the queen consort this morning, because she's the queen consort and it's inconvenient not to, then you've established that the procedure bends for rank. And if the procedure bends for rank, then it's not a procedure. It is a preference dressed up as a rule. And preference dressed up as a rule is not a foundation for anything. It is a stage set, convincing from a distance, hollow when examined. This was what Anne believed. She believed it with the kind of conviction that does not require argument to sustain it, that exists as fact rather than opinion in the mind of the person holding it. She had spent her entire working life in service to an institution that, whatever its complexities and imperfections, she had committed to with a seriousness that never wavered and never apologized for itself. She wasn't performing her position this morning. She was enacting it. The 20 minutes ended not with resolution but with a shift in the shape of the impasse. Camilla, who was also not a person who lacked intelligence about when to move, understood that the thing she was pushing against wasn't going to yield under pressure because it wasn't personal enough to yield under pressure. Personal things yield. Institutional things do not. They absorb and they hold and they wait, and what they wait for is the person pushing against them to recognize that the energy required to continue pushing is greater than the result justifies. She didn't concede the point, and that would be the wrong word for what she did. What she did was reframe it. She said, with the same quietness she had maintained throughout, that she accepted that the proper channels had to be followed, and that if the authorization could be pursued through those channels with appropriate urgency, she would wait on the answer before making any further decision. This wasn't quite the same as saying she would wear the original tiara. But it wasn't quite the same as insisting on the other one either. It was the middle space, the space where someone very intelligent has realized that the way out of a wall is not through it but around it, and has begun to look for the angle. Anne, who recognized this move because she had made versions of it herself over many decades in many different rooms, accepted the reframe. Pretty much, not warmly. Not kind of, with any particular generosity of manner, but she accepted it because it was, functionally, the correct thing to do. The authorization request would go through. It would be expedited because the morning demanded expediency. And the answer, when it came, would be the answer, whatever the answer was. The process would speak. That was what she had been asking for from the beginning. She left the room the way she had entered it, directly, without social noise, already in motion. She passed the guard at the door without looking at him. He kept his position and his expression and his complete professional neutrality, and watched her walk down the corridor at the pace of someone who has finished one thing and is already thinking about the next. Inside the room, the atmosphere shifted the moment the door closed. Not dramatically. Not with an exhalation of held breath or a visible relaxation of tension, the staff were too professional for that, and Camilla too composed. But, there was a change, which the particular weight that the presence of Princess Anne carried in any room she occupied, the density of purpose and will and zero tolerance for anything she considered unnecessary, had lifted. The room breathed differently without it. Camilla turned from the window. She looked at her lady-in-waiting, who met her gaze with the expression of a person who's ready to do whatever is needed and is simply waiting to be told what that's. Camilla said, calmly, that they should sit down and wait for the authorization answer, and that in the meantime they should alert her team to keep the timetable as stable as possible, and that if anyone outside the relevant circle asked any questions about the morning's delay, the answer was simply that preparations were ongoing. They sat. Well, they waited. The palace continued around them, the machinery of the day grinding forward, the procession preparations advancing, the guest lists assembling themselves in the relevant rooms, the whole elaborate structure of the public-facing event building toward its start time with the relentlessness of something that has been set in motion by many people and can't easily be stopped by one. 35 minutes had passed since the original request. The authorization request was moving through the Lord Chamberlain's office. The person who had received it understood the urgency. They also understood, I guess, the protocol. These two things weren't necessarily in conflict, but they weren't the same thing either, and the person navigating between them was doing so with the careful attention of someone who knew. That being the person who either authorized or declined this particular request, on this particular morning, with these particular principles involved, was a position of genuine consequence. Whatever they decided would be the decision. It would be on the record. Meanwhile, downstairs, in the section of the palace closest to the public entrance, the royal guard was changing positions in the regular rotation that governed their morning. The guard who had been standing nearest the corridor where all of this was unfolding was relieved by a colleague. He walked away from his post without knowing, in any detail, what had happened beyond the door he had stood beside for the last hour. But he had felt the weight of the morning through the walls, and he had a sense, the kind of sense that develops in people who spend a great deal of time being observant in conditions of enforced silence, that something had occurred. Something that mattered. Not in the way of catastrophe. In the way of a thing that reveals, clearly and, finally, what's actually true about a place and the people who run it. The authorization answer was coming. The timetable was holding, barely. And, inside a room in Buckingham Palace, a woman who had navigated rougher waters than this sat with her hands folded in her lap and waited for the answer with the particular patience of someone who has learned that patience, applied correctly, is not the same thing as weakness. It is sometimes the sharpest tool in the room. Outside, the sky hadn't changed. Still gray, still heavy, still pressing. But there was honestly a quality to the light now that suggested the clouds might be considering their options. Not breaking. Not yet, but, thinking about it, the way the change often announces itself before it arrives, quietly, almost imperceptibly, through a shift in the quality of the light rather than anything as obvious as the light itself. Inside, the clock on the wall moved forward. The machinery of the day didn't stop, in the Lord Chamberlain's office, a pen was hovering over a form that would, in a matter of minutes, determine how the rest of this morning went and what, in the long institutional memory of the royal household, this particular morning would be remembered as having demonstrated. The pen hadn't yet touched the paper. But it was close. The authorization didn't come through in the way anyone had anticipated. This is the thing about moments that have been building for an hour inside the controlled environment of a palace. When they finally resolve, they rarely resolve the way the people inside them imagined they would. The Lord Chamberlain's office, faced with the specific and time-pressured question of whether to approve an unscheduled change to the Queen Consort's authorized jewelry selection 40 minutes before a public procession, did what offices of that type tend to do when the pressure is acute and the principals involved are senior and the consequences of either decision aren't insignificant. They escalated. Not because they couldn't make the decision. Because they determined that the correct person to make this particular decision wasn't them. The correct person, in the judgment of the relevant official, was the king. This determination, clinical, procedurally sound, and, in its own way, an escalation of everything that had been happening since Camilla stood in front of her mirror and said she wanted the other one, moved through the internal communication systems of the palace with the discreet speed of something urgent that's not allowed to appear urgent, arriving at the king's private secretary, who received it and processed it and made the decision, which was his job, about whether to interrupt the king's morning schedule to bring it to him or to handle it within the discretion available to him. He decided to bring it to the king. Partly because it was the right call procedurally. Partly because the nature of the matter, a direct dispute between the Queen Consort's personal preference and the household's protocol structure, with Princess Anne having already been involved, was the kind of thing where operating without the king's knowledge felt like a greater risk than the interruption. The king was in his study. He received the summary from his private secretary in the particular way that he received many things, attentively, without visible irritation at the interruption, with the measured quality of attention that suggested he was already thinking 3 moves ahead of wherever the information currently was. He listened. He asked 2 questions. The private secretary answered them. The king was quiet for a moment, not a long moment, 15 seconds perhaps, the kind of silence that's actually thinking rather than the kind that's hesitation, and then, he said what the authorization answer would be. He said yes. Plus, not because he was overriding Anne. Not because he disagreed with the principle she had been applying. He said yes because the question that had been brought to him wasn't, at its root, a question about tiaras or authorization forms or the mechanics of the approval process. It was a question about what a marriage looks like, at the institutional level, on a morning when the institution's machinery has ground up against the personal dignity of the person who's, in the most fundamental sense, his partner in all of it. And, the answer to that question, the one that reflected what he actually believed about how that partnership should function, about what it meant to be the king in this particular way, in this particular era, with this particular woman beside him, was yes. He said it without theater, he said it in a single, calm sentence, and the private secretary noted it, and the note went back through the channel to the Lord Chamberlain's office, which formalized it in the appropriate way and communicated it to the relevant household staff, who communicated it to the room where Camilla was still sitting with her hands folded and her face composed and the clock on the wall having moved considerably further forward than was comfortable. The message arrived. The lady-in-waiting received it. She turned to Camilla and said, with the kind of precise understatement that's its own form of expressiveness, "The authorization has been granted." Camilla didn't visibly react, which this too is important. She didn't exhale in a way that communicated relief. She didn't allow her posture to change in any readable way. She simply looked at her lady-in-waiting and said, in the same quiet register she had used throughout the entire morning, "Good." And then, she stood, and she walked to the table where the tiara box was open, and the dresser came forward and they made the change officially, carefully, without ceremony of any kind, and the tiara that Camilla had wanted since the previous evening was placed on her head and the original piece was returned to its box and the box was closed. She stood in front of the mirror. She looked. She said nothing about it. She turned away from the mirror and began moving through the final preparations for departure with a focused purposefulness that communicated, as clearly as any words, that this part of the morning was over. Whatever it had been, whatever it meant, whatever its implications, that was for later. The day was now, and the day required her. The timetable had slipped by 47 minutes. Plus, this wasn't nothing. In the logistics of a royal public engagement, 47 minutes is a significant displacement. It creates cascading adjustments across every element that had been calibrated to the original start time, and each adjustment creates a further set of adjustments, and the whole machinery has to absorb the slip and compensate for it without the compensation being visible to the thousands of people assembled along the procession route where the camera operators positioned at intervals and the journalists who were already speculating, in quiet clusters along the mall, about what was causing the delay. The official explanation, delivered to the relevant parties in the appropriate measured tone, was that preparations had run slightly longer than anticipated. This wasn't untrue. Plus, it was also not complete. But, completeness, well, is not always what official explanations are for. Princess Anne, basically, who had been informed of the king's decision through the proper channel, received it the way she received most things, without visible reaction, without commentary, without any expression of either satisfaction or displeasure. She had held the line she believed needed to be held. The decision had been escalated above her level. That was the process working correctly, even if the outcome wasn't the one she had been working toward. The process, honestly, working correctly was, in the end, more important to her than any specific outcome. Basically, this wasn't a rationalization. It was what she actually thought. It was the thing that had organized her understanding of duty and institutional service for the entirety of her public life. You hold the line. You do it properly. The decision goes where it needs to go. Whatever comes out the other end is what it's. Your job was the holding. She was in, to be fair, a car on the way to her own morning engagement before the procession even started. She wouldn't be at the luncheon. She had her own full calendar, as she always did, and it didn't wait on palace disputes or authorization processes or the domestic arithmetic of a marriage managing itself in real time. She had her work, and she went to her work. That was who she was. Plus, for what it's worth, the guard who had stood outside the door that morning, the one who had spent an hour feeling the weight of something he couldn't hear clearly through the wall, was at a different post by the time the procession departed. His relief had taken over. He had gone through the regular rotation, performed his regular duties, eaten his regular lunch at the regular hour in the regular way that the daily structure of service requires. But the morning stayed with him in the way that certain mornings do. Not because he had understood what was happening on the other side of the door. He had understood very little of it, in its specifics. But he had understood the weight. And the weight had been real. He had felt it, standing in a corridor of Buckingham Palace, maintaining his position and his expression and his professional completeness, while something on the other side of a door resolved itself into what it was going to be. The procession departed 47 minutes late. The guest list had adjusted. The photographers had waited. The crowd along the mall, which had been standing in the grey London morning in that patient, slightly resigned way that British crowds have cultivated across centuries of waiting for things that are slightly late, registered the procession's arrival with the particular warmth of people who have been waiting long enough that arrival itself feels like an event. Camilla was in the carriage. The tiara she had wanted was on her head, catching the light, and there was light now, the clouds having made their decision sometime in the 40 minutes that had passed, breaking in the way. That, I think, London sky breaks when it finally commits to it, not gradually but all at once, the grey peeling back and the sun appearing with an almost assertive brightness, as if it had been held back all morning and was making up for it now. The tiara threw the light in 3 directions at once, the kind of refraction that makes professional photographers grateful and amateurs reach for their phones. She smiled at the crowd, which she waved with the specific quality of attention eye contact, turned toward individuals rather than toward the mass of people that had distinguished her public appearances for years, the thing she had developed naturally and that couldn't be entirely taught, this gift for making a crowd feel seen rather than processed. People pressed forward slightly at the barriers. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Phones went up. The carriage moved. Inside it, behind the smile and the wave and the practiced public ease, she was thinking, because she was always thinking, the outer composure had never meant the inner one was idle about the morning. Not with anger. Not with triumph. With something more complicated than either, the particular mix of feelings that comes when you've pushed for something you believed in and the push has cost more than you expected and the thing has come through in the end and you were left holding both the win and the cost simultaneously, and the cost is real even when the win is real, and the mix of the two is not something you perform your way through but something you carry. She would carry it, which the luncheon was everything that public royal luncheons are: structured, cordial, managed by the machinery of protocol that she now moved through with the ease of someone who has internalized the rules so completely that following them no longer requires conscious effort. She spoke to the right people in the right order. She gave the right amount of attention to each exchange. She was warm, and she was present, and she was exactly what she needed to be, which is what she was always doing, which was the job, and she was very good at the job, and had been good at it for long enough now that its difficulty wasn't always visible from the outside. The people who, for what it's worth, sat near her at the luncheon saw a woman of extraordinary composure, easy warmth, and genuine interest in the conversations she was having. They didn't see the morning. They saw the result of it, a woman who had navigated something difficult and had arrived at the other end of it intact and present and completely herself. This is the thing about composure at this level. It is not a mask. It is a practice. It is something built, over years, out of the necessity of having to be fully present in very public rooms on mornings when the private rooms have been complicated. She wore the tiara all day. Plus, she wore it well. Princess Anne, across town at her own engagement, wore what she had planned to wear that morning, said what she had planned to say, did what she had planned to do. She answered questions from the press with the particular directness that journalists had learned to expect from her and, sometimes to appreciate, because whatever else you could say about her, she didn't give you nothing. She gave you what she thought. Whether you wanted it or not was your problem, not hers. Nobody asked her about the morning. They wouldn't have known to ask. The morning had happened behind the walls of the palace, within the quiet internal world of an institution that's very practiced at keeping its internal weather separate from its public face. If there was a story, and there was, in the sense that there's always a story, always the real version of events running underneath the official one, it was a story that would live in the memories of the people who had been in that room. In the lady-in-waiting who had been the first to understand what Camilla wanted. In the honestly dresser who had opened the tiara box and then closed it and then opened it again. In the staff who had been present throughout and who would carry the morning with them with the same professional discretion with which they carried every morning that wasn't like other mornings. In the guard, standing at his next post, feeling something without knowing what to call it. And, in two women, each one entirely certain, in her own way, that she had been right about something, living with the particular complexity of having been in a room together where rightness turned out to be more complicated than either of them had wanted it to be that morning. Not wrong. Not mistaken. Just complicated in the specific way of things that involve two people who are both serious about principles they genuinely hold. Coming up against each other in a space where the principles themselves are real and are in tension and can't both win entirely. Neither of them lost entirely, either. This is the truth about mornings like this one, inside institutions like this one, between people like the two of them. They do not resolve cleanly. They leave something behind in the room, in the air, in the relationship, in the institutional memory. Not damage, necessarily. Sometimes just awareness. The awareness of where the lines are, who draws them, what happens when they're tested, and what the test reveals about the place and the people who run it. The procession had long since ended. The carriages were back in the mews. The crowd along the mall had dispersed into the city, carrying their photographs and their afternoon. The tiara was back in its box. The correct box. The authorized box. Plus, properly logged. Properly noted. The record, which was always the thing, in the end, the record accurate. The gray sky had returned by evening. London reassembling itself back into its ordinary overcast self as if the afternoon of brightness had been a temporary aberration rather than a commitment. But, it had been real, and the light had been real. The tiara catching it had been real. The woman in the carriage, smiling at a crowd that had waited in the cold to see her, wearing what she had chosen to wear, after a morning that had been harder than any of them would ever know, that had been real too. All of it had been real. That was the thing about this particular morning, in this particular palace, between these particular people. The weight of it was real, the procedure was real. The disagreement was real. Plus, pretty much, the love, underneath all of it, the king's yes, quiet and, final and, rooted in something the protocol forms would never capture, was real. And, sometimes the realest thing in a room full of people being very careful and, very professional and, very correct is the thing nobody says out loud. The thing that moves through channels and, arrives as a single word authorization and, means, at its most essential, that there's someone in this building who looked at the arithmetic of this morning and, decided that you mattered more than the form. The tiara had caught the light, that was enough.